Top Run, the Striped Tigers. The Vietnamese Rangers, distinguishable by their iconic black tiger logo, were considered some of the Republic of Vietnam's best troops. The Rangers were one of the elite formations of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, alongside the Airborne and the Marines. However, unlike the Marines and Airborne, which were elite regular infantry, trained for conventional operations with full artillery, armor, and air support, the Rangers were light infantry. They could not rely on these assets, instead being specially trained to operate in remote bases, the jungle, and mountains against communist forces. This specialization was forced onto the Ranger Corps during their formation. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, Allied leadership did not know how it would develop. Some thought that the North Vietnamese Army, the People's Army of Vietnam, would invade South, trying to take the newly formed republic in a conventional war, like in Korea. Others thought that the war would end up like the Malayan Communist insurgency, where communist guerrillas would try to subvert the control of the government through propaganda and terror. In the face of both of these threats, with the advice of the MAG commander, Lieutenant General John O'Daniel, the newly formed Army of the Republic of Vietnam would train 4 field divisions for conventional warfare, 13 territorial regiments for regional security, and 6 light divisions as a stopgap between the first 2 formations. However, General O'Daniel's successor, General Samuel Williams, believed that the primary threat to South Vietnam was from the north. As a result, the divisions were re-standardized into the first 7 infantry divisions, and the regional regiments were dissolved. The paramilitary Civil Guard and Self-Defense Corps would be developed to handle insurgent activity instead. But by the late 50s, it was very clear that communist forces had started their war against the Republic with guerrilla warfare. The South Vietnamese government was forced to deploy its military against it in 1957, inflicting heavy casualties on the developing insurgency. But even with these successful 1957 operations, the North decided to change its strategy, sending down specially trained insurgents to the South in 1959. The situation deteriorated into a full-scale insurgency. President Ngo Dinh Diem was convinced that dedicated military personnel were desperately needed to keep South Vietnam stable. On February 15, 1960, against the advice of his American advisors, he sent orders down to South Vietnamese divisional and regional commanders to form dedicated counterinsurgency companies. The 4th company of each 4-company infantry battalion would be detached and given specialized training to fight guerrilla warfare. Each of these special action companies would have 3 40-man platoons, making a total of 131. By March, the military regions and divisions were expected to form and retrain 50 of these companies. Eventually, it was hoped that 65 would be deployed in the field, approximately 9,000 men total, specialized in hunting down and destroying the communist guerrillas. General Williams tried to convince President Ngo Dinh Diem against this, arguing that there would be severe logistics, training, leadership, deployment, and funding issues. Even then, the South Vietnamese president stood firm on his decision. South Vietnam desperately needed to fight against the insurgency. It was clear to American assistants that the decision was final. To support this effort, 3 U.S. Army Special Forces teams, along with intelligence and psychological warfare specialists, were deployed to South Vietnam in May. Independently, in January 1961, the U.S. Department of Defense approved the counterinsurgency plan to try to counter the critical situation. By this point, the Rangers had 65 fully trained and deployed companies, but now would be expanded further to 86. The U.S. Special Forces developed training teams which would work with the Rangers in the field, training and advising them while they were fighting the enemy. But even with this force in the field, the insurgency only grew. Due to the increasing number of battalion and regiment-sized communist attacks, these companies were reorganized into 20 Ranger battalions by March 1965, which were then placed under the direct control of the 4 Corps commanders. Unfortunately, while they were trained in counterinsurgency, the Corps commanders typically misused them as a reserve, deploying them as an elite reinforcing unit to counter critical communist attacks. Eventually, the ARVN Rangers lost their role and skills in direct counterinsurgency to Special Forces teams which had been developed. But due to their enhanced training, they were still considered elite troops and deployed to more combat-heavy areas. Unlike the other two elite formations of South Vietnam, the Airborne and the Marines, which were controlled by Saigon directly, the Rangers grew to serve as the reserve of each ARVN Army Corps. As a result, they were often the first elite troops to be deployed to deteriorating situations, suffering high casualty rates compared to the regular ARVN infantry. Additionally, since the Rangers were detached from the regular ARVN infantry divisions, they relied directly on the Corps command structure for administration. This resulted in the Rangers often being neglected. They suffered from poor logistics and a lack of a reserve pool of trained personnel, all while facing some of the heaviest fighting in the war. The ARVN Rangers faced severe morale and discipline problems throughout the first half of the war, which caused very high rates of desertion compared to the rest of the South Vietnamese military. Even then, it was under this heavy combat that the Rangers would eventually be molded into their signature role, the elite light infantry. Unlike the Airborne or Marines, they could not reliably depend on the Air Force, Armor, or Navy to provide transportation or fire support. While the Airborne were based in Saigon and flown to their deployments, the Rangers were usually already near the battlefield, being located at one of the many fire support bases in the mountains, jungles, or major cities. The Rangers developed a large skill set, gaining experience fighting from in the cities to the most remote parts of the country. Their high desertion and casualty rates also ensured that any remaining men were the best of the best. In 1966, to resolve these ongoing issues with support, the Rangers were formally reorganized into Ranger groups. Each Ranger group would have 3 to 5 Ranger battalions each. The group commands were hoped to create a stronger link between the Corps commander and the battalions on the ground. Each Corps would be assigned 1 Ranger group as their elite reserve, and the 5th would be deployed by Saigon to serve as another national reserve, alongside the Airborne and Marines. Even with 20 battalions and 5 Ranger groups already in the field, the ARVN Rangers would double in size. With the American involvement winding down in 1970, American-led Special Forces programs were also being shut down. This included the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or CIDG program, which recruited ethnic minorities and trained them in anti-guerrilla warfare. They had actually been the organization which pushed the Rangers out of their counterinsurgency role. They manned many camps on the outskirts of South Vietnam, using the special knowledge of the local highland population to counter the National Liberation Front. In a twist of fate, they were being absorbed into the Rangers. During August to December 1970, 37 of the CIDG camps were converted into Border Ranger battalions. They formally received a unit number as part of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and their commanders were given a formal rank in the ARVN chain of command. However, even while these CIDG personnel were now called Rangers, and also operated as elite light infantry, they had the opposite role of the regular ARVN Rangers. The regular ARVN Rangers were more mobile, being deployed anywhere Corps Command or ARVN leadership needed them. The Border Rangers, on the other hand, were static. They were intimately familiar with the remote areas around their bases. Because of this, they were kept at their fire bases to act as a remote first line of detection and defense, and were expected to withdraw or hold their positions while other ARVN forces could be deployed to reinforce them. By January 1973, an additional Ranger battalion had been formed. Each Ranger group was standardized to 3 battalions each, creating a total of 7 Ranger groups. The Corps commanders each had a local Ranger group, and 3 were kept with the General Reserve alongside the Airborne and Marine divisions. 4 of the Border Ranger battalions had been disbanded as a result of the loss of their fire bases during the Easter Offensive, giving the Vietnamese Rangers a total of 54 Ranger battalions. The Rangers would be reorganized for the final time in 1973. In September, General Galvan Vien submitted a recommendation to reform the Rangers from 54 battalions to 45, arranged into 15 Ranger groups. The President of South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu, gave his approval. There would no longer be any distinction between the regular and border Rangers, as all groups and battalions would have the exact same organization. Ranger Groups 4, 6, and 7 would officially be listed under the General Reserve, while the other groups were renumbered according to their military region. The number of Ranger groups varied per region, with Region 2 fielding the largest number of Rangers due to its vast size and heavy jungle terrain. Due to the main Communist divisions being decimated in 4 Corps earlier in the year, the 9 Ranger battalions in its 44th Special Tactical Zone were dissolved, and its personnel reassigned north. Military Region 4 was now considered to be secure from Communist insurgency, and now no longer needed any native Ranger units to be assigned to it. This final order of battle would be the structure of the Rangers until the end of the war. The regular and border Rangers were not the only units under the banner of the Rangers. The Rangers had one final unit. It was considered the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's best infantry force, the 81st Airborne Rangers. The 81st had been originally formed as the 91st Ranger Battalion in 1964 as part of Project Delta. Delta was a special forces project, but specialized in long-range recon and intel gathering. It performed special operations independent of regular ARVN forces, with small teams dropping directly into insurgency areas at dusk to gather intelligence or strike small targets. By the time of the American withdrawal, they had grown to the size of a Ranger group and were given parachute training, developing into the 81st Airborne Rangers. This crack unit combined the best traits of the ARVN Airborne and ARVN Rangers, performing exceptionally in the field as elite light infantry like the Rangers, but having the discipline and material support of the Airborne. Their beret was neither the Airborne Red nor the Ranger Brown, but rather they decided to keep the Special Forces dark green. At the end of the war, 1975, the Rangers were planned to undergo an additional reorganization into 2 Ranger divisions. These would be the 101st and 106th Ranger divisions. Unfortunately, with the imminent collapse of South Vietnam and all forces on full retreat, this reorganization never came to fruition. Even during the fall of South Vietnam, the Rangers demonstrated that they stood amongst the elites of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. As the force deployed to guard the outskirts of the country, they were some of the first units hit by PAVN forces during the collapse of the Central Highlands. And at the end, ARVN Rangers formed a significant portion of the defensive ring around Saigon, fighting to the last day of the Vietnamese Republic. The 81st Airborne Rangers single-handedly held off the advance of the 10th PAVN Division into the Joint General Staff Headquarters, destroying numerous T-54s and inflicting heavy casualties on the North Vietnamese infantry. The 81st would eventually be the very last unit in Saigon to surrender. While the other South Vietnamese soldiers were forced to strip out of their uniform, Colonel Phan Van Thuan ensured that they would be able to wear their uniform after laying down their arms by threat of force. The Airborne Rangers, like the rest of the Rangers, kept their honor to the end.